Thanks for joining me, Marilyn.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nate.
I find this interesting because in some ways people will see us as very different politicians, but we actually have a couple things in common, and I want to start with a hard-hitting question, which is, what is your favorite thing about the Brigden Fair?
Okay, definitely the pies. The Brigden Fair pies are renowned, and it's a good thing. What is your favorite thing about the Brigden Fair?
My favorite thing about the Brigden Fair is the Carney Games. That I try to spend as little money as possible to win one of those overpriced stuffies for my kids.
And just for those of you who don't know the Brigden Fair, this is a fair, I think it's one of the largest fairs in Ontario, where 40,000 people come through in a weekend.
That's amazing.
So if you haven't been, you need to come.
Yeah, 100%. I've been going for years. I have the T-shirt that says Thanksgiving tradition. The Brigden Fair is a Thanksgiving tradition because it is in our family, and so that's the starting point is. And Marilyn represents Sarnia, Lambton, and my wife's family is. I got family on my own side in Sarnia, but my wife's family is in Lambton County, proper God's country, and the farm's been in the family since 1834 there.
Wow. Well, the community is beautiful, as you know, and I'm sure this is not the time that I should say that the beaches of Sarnia, Lambton are nicer than the beaches of East York. I'm sure that's not really where I ought to go with this, but it's great that you've been down to the riding, and certainly I think that when I first went there, which was 1984, I've been there ever since. Raised my kids. We have a family tradition of taking the kids to the Brigden Fair, and I can remember them all eating cotton candy and bouncing off the walls.
Yeah, it's the best, and it's huge. It's huge. Like people will, and I try to explain to people in my riding about the Beaches Lions Easter Parade, which is tens of thousands of people. We just had it. It was like probably 50,000 people on the street in warm weather, and people go, "That can't be right. Yeah, that doesn't happen in the beaches." Yeah, it happens here. It's the same with the Brigden Fair. It's huge.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's my hard-hitting question. The other the other thing that we have in common is we have both lost a leadership race.
Yes, we have that in common. We are losers together.
Now, I just went through a provincial leadership race. What was my experience? I had a great experience. I'm very glad I did it. It was a lot of lessons learned along the way. I think we helped shape the race in a serious way, though, in terms of ideas, and certainly when I look at the shape of and the direction of the Ontario Liberal Party, I like to think we helped to set it on that direction to some small extent at least. What was your experience in leadership? Were there particular moments that stood out?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree overall that it was a great life experience. For me, traveling across the country and meeting with all these different Canadians who wanted to tell you what kinds of policies they thought the government should come with, visiting the beautiful country, that was key. And then, I mean, obviously I was disappointed in the same way as you were with the result. But I put a lot of policy platforms out there that have been picked up by multiple parties since then. So I do think there was a lasting impact. And of course, for myself, I still do get communications from people across the country that are encouraging me, glad to see me still in politics.
Did you travel much? Like the best thing for me was traveling in Northern Ontario. Oh yeah, okay.
So Nunavut I'd never been to, and when we got there, there's a strategy in leadership races. Basically, every riding gets a certain number of points, and even though there's only 55 members in Nunavut, it would still get the same weight of points as Calgary. So I was like, okay. So we went there, and we got snowed in on a blizzard, and we actually were only supposed to be there for like 2 days or something. We ended up staying for 5 or 6 days because we couldn't get out, and the people that were coming into our Airbnb couldn't get in. So it was a great opportunity to experience the far north and see what life there is really like. And,
does this make the book, by the way? People should know who are listening that I didn't know this until I attended. You were chairing. I don't know if you still do, but you were chairing the Status of Women Committee, and I attended as a just taking someone who was busy that day or had some other obligation. I was just filling in, but you were talking about. It's called
Tales
trotted the
of
globe.
The Globe Trot. So I was a chemical engineer before I turned to the dark side of politics, and Basically, I traveled around to all of the places globally that Dow Chemical was established. And so that's in the book, all the adventures I had there. And then coming into politics and some of the adventures that happened, even on the leadership race. I think Nunavut's in there and Miramichi and a couple of locations like that. So fun for everyone. And, yeah.
I was on a flight coming back from Ottawa to Toronto this week and sat next to a flight attendant who wasn't working, and she was rhyming off all the places. She's been everywhere and anywhere. Does any particular place stand out for you from that book and from your travels?
I think every place has got its own flavor. And so I enjoyed them all. I think the most beautiful thing I ever saw was in Thailand when I saw the moon over the Indian Ocean. It was just close enough to touch, and one of those surreal experiences where you think, am I in a dream or is this real? So that was gorgeous. But I mean, Europe is wonderful. South America, the people are so passionate, and there's such a great rawness to the country. And Asia Pacific was always hilarious because, of course, I'm 6'2". So you can picture me amongst those that are smaller, being on the subway. I look like Gulliver's Travels in the middle of all of these people talking on their cell phones. So lots of humorous things that happened, and many, many great memories.
I have not written a globetrotting book, and I haven't globetrotted overwhelmingly, but parliamentary travel did at one point take me to Zambia. And we were traveling from Lusaka, where the parliamentary conference was, to Victoria Falls. And a number of us, I forget who the Conservative was. Tilson? No. Who? Blanking on the Conservative. But Murray Rankin was there. There were a few of us there traveling. And the driver went the wrong. There was only it's a fork in the road. That is it. You either go left or you go right. And he went the wrong way. And we were halfway to Zimbabwe before I looked at it and was like, what is going on? The odometer was broken. Anyway, I ended up asking him to sit in the passenger seat, and I sped through. I just drove a minivan of parliamentarians as fast as I could to get to Victoria Falls before, so we actually
could write a book. You could write a book, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I think parliamentary travel is a great opportunity for people to establish relationship. People see us in question period, and they see the theater, the combative theater, and think that it's always that
Poor
way.
theater.
Well, for sure. Whereas in reality, a lot of MPs are very collegial with one another. You and I met, I can remember at the beginning. Do you remember you had a private member's bill on,
yes.
It was animal rights, and at that time in Sarnia, Lambton, there was Joe the cat that had just been shot 17 times. It was a big deal. So that was kind of our first meeting, and I think the beginning of a great friendship.
Yeah. And we certainly have disagreements, but they don't undermine the ability to be collegial with one another, for sure, and have that civility.
And that's what Canadians want, I think. Is for people
I
to
think
be able to
overwhelmingly so,
disagree about how, and where the country ought to go, but to do it in a way that's respectful.
Yeah, and there's a question period. There is a certain direct back and forth, and attacks sometimes, and it's all in the game. But you do have to put your swords down at some point. I think we're worse at that. I mean, not necessarily you and I, but collectively worse at that. You hear stories, you don't want to say everything was, better back in the day, but you hear stories from people who used to have dinner together in a more serious way, would get together in a more collegial way. It doesn't happen quite as much, I don't think.
And I would say, and I don't know if you think this, but even since we got elected in 2015, I thought things were a lot more collegial then than we're at today.
Yeah. It's tough, I think, in some ways. I mean, because of the pandemic, and because of if people haven't worked so closely together in person, haven't had the parliamentary travel, haven't had committees where they're together side by side. I mean, there's always going to be the sniping. Some members in particular are particularly bad at it and don't care about being collegial at all. But I do think, just to your point about travel, I think being together goes a long way, and telling personal stories and sharing stories about family and all that. Which reminds me, so talking about theater and performance. So you mentioned you were at Dow Chemical. I read you were there for 21 years. You were director of engineering at Suncor. You then became a consultant. What I did not read in your bio, though, is that you were also a stand-up comedian, which I read in the Hill Times. So walk me through that. I mean, that's obviously not a professional
So,
stand-up career.
no,
You
not
got a
at all.
joke to
So
share?
that
What's the
started
story?
out, I was a camp counselor, okay? So
Okay.
camp counselor, different ages of kids. And, I'd watch the kids all week, and then they usually had a skit talent night on the Friday night. And so I'd get up and do a monologue, basically, mocking all the children, which is, not very nice, but it was quite funny, and they all did laugh, and it was all intended in good fun. So after that, then I went off to university, and I was well known for quipping and being funny. And so when there was open mic nights, that's how I started, just showing up and doing a rant of various types. And so I would say that being a stand-up comic is a lot of fun, but it's not a great skill to be in politics with, because when things are printed in black and white, it's not necessarily taken in the same context it was delivered in. So I learned quickly to be very careful about quipping in politics.
Yeah, I know you have had some moments where you've said some things, and then you're like, "Well, I didn't mean it in that way." Stand-up comedy, it's a no holds barred. I mean, you're rewarded for pushing the envelope. Politics is the opposite.
Exactly. So I had to curb that in. I write poetry as well, and so when I was at Dow, I was well known to be the writer of trite verse. So if anybody had a retirement or a birthday or an occasion, they would come and I would write something funny that took their personal details. And so I brought that to the house, but my constituents are not fond of the poems that I do. I think I did 4 of them in the first 4 years I was elected, and I was told to be more serious. So I haven't done any more.
So I only saw one of them. I was not a fan, I got to be honest. Not because of the poetry per se, but because it was an anti-pot poem, and I thought it was terrible on the policy. but maybe
No,
the
for
rhyming
sure.
was okay. I don't
And
know.
it was one of those Fridays. Fridays are slow days in Parliament, and I had what they call an SO31, which is a 1-minute thing, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be funny? But apparently not everyone shared that, and things live on the internet forever. So.
Well, yeah, because you are now in Hansard. You are responsible for the line, "Keep our great country safe from all the weed." Which made me laugh, because then I knew there were cannabis growers investing in your writing.
I know, and my children, they weren't on the same page either. So.
Yeah, I bet not. Yeah, my conservative cousins in Sarnia weren't on the same page as you.
I know. To be honest, the Conservative Party had a diversity of views on that particular issue,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
at the time, you had to take a decision which way to go. So we decided to point out the potential harms and take, that kind of a hard line. So, you know what?
But you're now like the sky. You would agree. I say this to Garnett all the time, by the way, Garnett Genius, because he and I had debated this ad nauseum. But you would agree the sky hasn't fallen in the same way some of your colleagues thought it might.
What I would say is that a lot of the concerns that I raised, one of them was that everybody else that legalized saw a 32% increase in drug-impaired driving. And we have seen that. And so, that's an opportunity to do better. And I think the other thing is allowing home grow. I said, this is not going to go well. And so we've seen a lot of cases where that's not been well say policed or enforced, and so it's either impacting on neighbors' properties or there's people abusing it. We've got a warehouse growing in Petrolia. Guys show up on Sunday night. They've got licenses from Brampton, but they're growing like hundreds of pot plants. That there's a stench, there's an impact. So I would say those kind of issues, noise, light, and odor, are probably the remnant. But overall, no, I think it's fine, except that the provinces were allowed to do a different thing, each one. And in Ontario, I'm not sure how it is in your riding, but in our riding, we have so many pot stores, they're having trouble staying in business.
Yeah. I think that's the case. But like the private market will sort that out. I mean,
Yeah, definitely.
I would have probably gone more of an OCS route as opposed to just having shops crop up and then go bankrupt and on and on. We saw the same thing with, I think, an overinvestment in growing and then scaled back. We're seeing the same thing, overinvestment in retail. It's scaling
Yeah,
back.
and I don't think we got rid of organized crime, the way that the goal was.
Not as much. So there is a recent report on this from a task force that looked into it. And on the question, they didn't speak to the question of impaired. I mean, part of that is a question of we're now we're now policing it and so measuring it and calculating statistics. So it's not necessarily that it's higher than it was when it was illegal in quite the same way. But they did point to what you just said, which is we've made inroads, but not sufficient inroads to where we want to go. And partly it's an enforcement issue, and it's a municipal and provincial enforcement issue, where when things are contrary to the regime as they are, if there's a pot shop that is in the gray market or the black market, it should be closed down so that the legal owner isn't punished here. So yeah, there is still work to do, but I think overwhelmingly success. And I want to get to this because well, before we do, actually, I want to highlight some wins, because you have had 2 private members wins, and that's very rare. And so worth at least pausing before I get to your civil liberties work, which is what I want to spend a good amount of time on, because I think it's really interesting, another thing we share in common in terms of our interests. But you passed 2 private members' bills through the House, one initially palliative care, and then on pension protections. And I find it interesting. I always think of private members' business as an incredible vehicle to shape the government's agenda. I always figure it's not necessarily going to pass, but I'm going to shape the agenda. You've got things passed.
Yeah, I mean, I was voted the most collegial parliamentarian twice. Once when I first got there, and they said, wait till you've been locked up in this toxic place for a few years, that'll change, but didn't seem to. And then with palliative care, I worked on this. It was at the time the MAID legislation was coming through, and I said, well, it's a good thing we have good palliative care in this country, because in Sarnia, Lambton, we've got St. Joe's Hospice, we've got palliative beds at the hospital, we've got an integrated home care thing. And my seatmate at the time said, no, only 30% of Canadians have any access. And so that was why the bill was supposed to get consistent access to palliative care for everyone. And we've been able to double the amount of palliative care that's available across the country, so that's a positive. But there's more work to be done for sure. And then the second one was pension protection, and it was my neighbor who worked at Sears, who worked her whole life and was going to retire.
Yes.
And then when it went bankrupt, you know, she was out and had to keep working. And I thought, that's just not right. There's been so many companies go bankrupt. And really, when you work for them and you pay into your pension, that's part of the employment contract. You expect you're going to get that. So we put a bill in to make sure that pensions were considered in priority in the case of bankruptcy, and did get all party support. So
yeah, which is interesting, because previous iteration of the Conservative Party did not support that kind of legislation. And then I was on the industry committee before you had introduced that bill, but I think it was a block bill that was before us, substantially the same. And the Conservative Party shifted its position. We had a conversation on our side that I wasn't there when they had the other position, but on our side, staff were telling us, oh no, they're going to oppose it. And I was like, I don't think based on the way things are going, I don't think they are.
This is how you change things, is you change things from within. So in my time at the Conservative Party, I can remember when I was the health critic. And at that time, you know, the philosophy was, well, we're going to raise health transfer payments by a percentage, and that's our policy. I said, no, that's not a policy. You know, we need fulsome addiction from prevention to recovery. We need mental health supports, palliative care, all these different things. And now we see that, you know, that has infiltrated the party. In the same way, the change of support for making sure that pensions were a priority. So I'm one of less than 50 MPs that have ever passed 2 private members' bills, and so I consider that to be, a positive.
And you may be the only member of Parliament who has occupied a role that you currently occupy, which is, I know there have been many shadow ministers of health, there have been many shadow ministers of trade. You are, I think, the first shadow minister of civil liberties. So, I mean, walk us through. But before we get there, actually, I should say, just so you know, like I before politics, I volunteered for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. I was a lawyer as a very young lawyer, so I think we share an interest in protecting civil liberties. What do you, when you were appointed in this role, you said to the local media, at least, you said, I think this role has a lot of opportunity in it. Where do you see that opportunity? What's the day-to-day, and what are you focused on?
I mean, obviously, most people, you know, came to Canada, or value about Canada are freedoms. And that's something I'm passionate about. People stood in frozen trenches for years to fight for the freedoms that we have. And we're talking about freedom of expression and freedom of religion and all these various freedoms, security of the person, all of these things. And so, you know, this has been a time in our history where there has been a lot of debate about freedom of expression. There has been an increase in, I think, violent acts against religious groups within the country. We see the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of Islamophobia, Christian churches torched in our country. All of these things very disturbing to the basic freedoms that people value. And so I see in this role an opportunity to be kind of a watchdog, to see what's going on. The Emergency Measures Act, that one has been before the courts, and there was a returning from Judge Mosley that in fact people's rights were infringed. And so I think we need to learn and protect these things, because this is what sets Canada apart in many ways from other countries, is not just our compassion and humanitarianism, but the freedom to live how you want here in our country while respecting other people's freedoms as well.
What do you make of, no doubt, freedom is an incredibly powerful idea, and I think it's a central part of Canadian politics in our history in many ways, and especially freedom of expression, both in politics but also in jurisprudence. It is the foundational right to our democracy, and the closer you get to political speech, the more protected it is. And same with religious freedom. I mean, when the Charter was enacted, and we're actually a day later, it was yesterday that we had the 42nd anniversary of the Charter, which improved freedom in this country, no doubt. When Poilievre says he wants to make this country the freest country in the world, what does that mean exactly, given we are starting from a place of great freedom?
Well, we started from a place of great freedom. There has been an erosion of our freedoms over time. And so what I would say is I put together a plan to make Canada the freest nation to present to the leader. And some of the elements, are already in the public realm. We have a concern about the government's ability to take down an individual's content. Certainly there are hate speech rules, and I am not condoning hate speech in any way. But there's offensive speech as well. And offensive speech is part of free speech. So I may not like what you say, but you have a right to say it, and we need to defend your ability to say it, because it's healthy for democracy, for people to express different views even if they don't agree. And so.
Well, what do you think? So I don't disagree with any, and I would add, though, it's not just hate speech. There's defamation. There are civil offenses related to defamation. There's misleading advertising rules. You can't make false claims to consumers. We restrict speech in different, very specific ways.
We can't enforce them. Today, the thresholds for proving hate speech, or in Ontario with the defamation laws being where they are, they can say whatever they want about you in politics. It's very difficult for you to come with a defamation suit and win that. It's a lot of your personal money out the door before you may or likely may not, and years to wait because of the delays in the court system. So to me, making sure people have the ability to speak freely within the bounds of what is allowed.
But what do you think? So when you say there's been an erosion, I think were your words.
Mm-hmm. So
I would share your view, like on the Emergencies Act, like I expressed concerns with the invocation on the thresholds. I expressed some concerns with the way it was implemented. I do think there's a difference between freedom of expression and blocking roads, and that was a real problem in Ottawa.
We don't support that.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that what's more worrisome is people's jobs being threatened because of what they've said. They don't agree with their stance on you name whatever it is, and they threaten their jobs, or try to cancel them, and get people to shame them. Certainly, as a political figure, I'm sure you're the same. After a while, the vitriol that you see, you become numb to it, and it doesn't influence you. You still want to do the right thing.
Yeah, I tell my mom, don't read the comments.
Well, for sure, I tell my kids too, because they'll say, what up, Mom? And I'll say, just keep it positive and try to do the right thing. But,
but do you think it's led by governments? Because I don't see. No, we can debate the Online Harms Act, because I think there's stuff there.
I think within government it's more civilized. We actually have done a better job the discourse. I think it's outside, it's activist groups that are either to the left or the right on the extreme that are driving this, what I consider to be an erosion of people's ability to freely say. And so people are afraid to speak out because they'll be hated on, they'll be, their children will be bullied at school and that sort of thing. So that's not good for democracy or for freedom. Freedom of religion, I'm especially concerned right now when I look across the country and I see what's happening to our Jewish community and how scared they are. And I didn't think that we would allow these things to happen in Canada, and I thought there would be some enforcement. And it really looks like there's a struggle there that is not landing in the right spot.
No question. So it's such a fraught issue, right? Because on the one hand, we all ought to stand up and condemn anti-Semitism and then some. It is where someone's targeted for their faith, where someone is targeted for who they are, where someone is, in many cases, more recently, where they are targeted and they are effectively assigned responsibility for the actions of a foreign state just because of their Jewish identity. That is anti-Semitic and that is wrong. Now,
well, it's not just, and it's not just them. I mean, the LGBTQ would tell you that they are hugely afraid. I heard Richard Canning, who's an MP, NDP MP, and Randall Garrison. And Randall shared that, he's tried to get people to replace him as an openly gay member of Parliament, and they're too afraid to run because of the hate that's out there. So I think, in all of these areas, we've just seen a rise in the level of attack, freedom of religion, freedom from discrimination. All of these things seem to be in a touchy place. So I think the government has a role to play in standing up for those things and being brave enough to reinforce the ability of people to say things that may not be welcome, that may not be agreed upon by all, but that we are in a better place if we do that. And love and tolerate each other in the country. We can't control necessarily what goes on in other countries, and that sometimes is a source of division for us, that we disagree about what's going on someplace else. But at least if we can agree, let's make Canada a safe place to, freely live and do what you want, be who you are, all that kind of stuff.
But how do you? But the rights collide, right? And so that sense of security that you are talking about is in some ways directly at odds with a full desire to say we're gonna accept and defend free expression regardless if it upsets people. And so you take someone who says Israel's committing genocide as an example, and or you take someone who protests outside of let's say a synagogue, because the synagogue is, if you just protest a synagogue, that is anti-Semitic on the face of it. If you are protesting a place that is hosting the sale of properties that you believe are this is stolen land, then that's a different thing. And how do you navigate that desire to protect civil liberties with that desire to make sure everyone feels safe to be, attending their religious ceremonies?
Well, for me, I'm a rule of law person. So if we want something to happen, we have to make sure it's reflected in the law, and we have to uphold the law and enforce the law. And so what I'm seeing is that we have lots of good laws in the country that are not being enforced. Especially if I look at the anti-Semitism rise that's currently happening and some of the attacks on Muslims in our country, the Christian churches being torched, there's laws that are actually not being enforced. And so I think...
Yeah, I wonder what this, because I actually would land in the same place in that I don't think we need to create new rules and laws per se. It really is about enforcement. And again, that enforcement has to be careful in some ways. You just saw actually in the Ontario legislature, the speaker...
Yes, I saw that they've decided, to rule on something that, has to do with people making political statements with what they wear. I think that's the one you're referring to.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
so, there is a shared responsibility because it's the federal government that sets the law, but in many cases it's the provincial government that's in charge of enforcing. And so I think there's a duty on both parts to uphold the law. It makes for a civilized community.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, so what happened recently and became fodder for all party leaders, actually, I think, was provincially, I should say, here in Ontario. So keffiyeh, commonly worn scarf among Arabs, but special significance to Palestinian people. The speaker ruled that it's a political statement, and then you had Doug Ford, you had Bonnie Crombie, you had Merritt Stiles. They all came out and they said, you got to reverse this decision, and that people should be free to wear what matters to them as a matter of their identity. I would agree with all three of those leaders, but it does.
But I think
there's a tension there.
Federally, there was a law that said you were not allowed to do anything to support terrorist organizations.
Yes.
And so that law was repealed when the Liberals came in. Otherwise, you could not wear a scarf, for example, that promoted Hamas, because Hamas has been designated as a terrorist organization since 2003. So these are examples where the law is important. What's in place is important, and then the enforcement is important. And in my role as civil liberties, it's to try to point out, where do we have it right, and do we need anything extra in order to provide protections for those important freedoms.
And so when you look at the online harms bill, for example, it principally is trying to address the very things that you're talking about. By the sounds of it, it is.
Except that. Who determines in the online harms bill what is the hate speech that you're going to go to prison for life for, and whether or not you're likely to commit a hate speech in the future? That's where I think it gets very touchy. Who's going to predict that? That's subject to some bias, and so I think
but it would all be the police, right? Like, because you do have in those questions that you're talking about, there is a commitment to create a new agency that is focused on more algorithmic accountability. But when you're talking about individual imprisonment, you are talking about the police and the courts and our public prosecutors. And I would actually share some skepticism that the peace bond that you're talking about is necessary in some ways. But I did have in my own community, I'll tell you, there was a guy who was publishing a paper. He would distribute, I think, he would claim it was over 300,000 copies of it. It was deeply anti-Semitic. It was deeply misogynistic. He ended up going to jail, actually. So first I helped stop it through Canada Post. That was one thing. But the police finally, they did their job. They enforced the law. The courts he was prosecuted and he was sentenced to imprisonment. And you could imagine a situation where he's going to publish the thing. He's got, it's tougher with the internet, right? But in this case, it was a paper publication, hundreds of thousands of copies. You could probably, in that instance, reasonably say, we have evidence that he's going to publish this. We have evidence that it's full of hate, criminal level hate. And so we're going to take steps to prevent that from happening. But it is, I don't want to dismiss I think that is a fair debate point. I think it's less fair to say it's going to be the Liberal government or we're in the court system at that point.
Yeah, and I think that people have lost trust in the system. And so what's important is when there is enforcement of these things, that it's made public, because I think that's a deterrent as well. When people learn, okay, they really are enforcing this rule, they really do mean that they can do that. I think that's important also.
Yeah, and so I've got it right when it comes to, you're looking at online harms from the perspective of, if it's policing hate speech as defined by courts and in the criminal code, that's a bar that makes sense. If you're looking at I think there are areas that are obvious where we would just start nodding our heads immediately, especially around protecting kids and the sharing of non-consensual images and all of that. I think where I looked at it was where you move from the criminal remedy to the civil remedy in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. That's an area where, again, I think is a worthwhile debate point. But substantively, for the most part, when I looked at the way the bill was structured, I know Polyev said, it's a censorship right from the get-go, but I looked at it, I was like, no, we could have a thoughtful conversation about some particular elements of this.
Well, I think we will have thoughtful conversations. And
will they be thoughtful, though?
Well, if I'm involved, they will be thoughtful.
Yeah, okay, all right.
I would say that what we don't want to see, everybody wants to protect the children. What I don't want to do is to create a parallel justice system with this committee that's going to look at those complaints and do a resolution that doesn't actually have sort of the ability to assign criminality. I think we can't replace the courts on that, and so there's lots of subjects for debate.
But the premise is your initial point, I think, was enforcement's a problem.
Yeah.
And so here you have a legislative response from the government of the day that says we agree, and here's a way we're going to try to improve enforcement while maintaining the high thresholds that already exist at law.
Well, I mean, let the debate ensue. At this point, I'm not convinced. I'll hear the arguments, but right now it looks like what they've created is a digital complaints parallel process that has no teeth to it. And so you're going to put the kids that have been sexploited or whatever through this process, and I'm not sure that that's going to be a better remedy for them, or that it's going to address the issue. And on the assigning life imprisonment for crimes committed with hate speech, again, the threshold of proving hate speech hasn't been very well achieved in the country. And so,
why do you say that?
Well, I mean, is there a plethora of people that have been convicted of hate speech? I'm not aware that there are. And
No,
so,
because you want it to be a high bar to protect civil liberties and freedom of expression, right?
well, do you want it to be that high when you see that it's propagating across the country right now unchecked? So I think that's the debate is.
But do you want police knocking on your door and saying we think your tweet is hate speech?
I
You know
do
what I mean?
not want the word police. Nobody wants the word police. But I do think that there are things that Canadians could agree on that are hate speech, that you shouldn't have to have a huge burden of proof and spend, arguably hundreds of thousands of dollars to take it through the courts to get a remedy. So I think there's room for more discussion on this. People care about freedom of expression, and we see things that we don't like in our current society. And so I think
That's interesting
the
because
value of debate.
I feel like I feel like maybe I'm more of the civil liberties.
Maybe you're more of a conservative than you thought.
Yeah,
Bring it home.
But I would say I agree with you on the enforcement side, but I do want the thresholds quite high when it comes to speech. I don't if it's look there are existing categories: harassment, defamation, false advertising. We have hate speech. We have categories, and we should make sure those are properly enforced, and that if you say, if you've got the individual in my community who sends a publication around and he goes to jail, good. But if he does the very same thing on the internet, he probably skates. And that's a problem, that our laws need to reflect the fact we all live online. Having said that, you don't want to diminish the threshold, I don't think.
Well, and your point is well taken. I don't think our laws today really address the digital age
Yeah.
and the upcoming AI and things like that. So those are things that the federal government is currently talking about.
Yeah.
I think this is a big area where we've got to be careful about the legislation, but we do need something because right now it's a vacuum.
You have made a very eloquent case for the online harms bill.
This was not my intention.
But I do think you're right to point. It's incredibly fraught. Because the question of Israel and Palestine and the atrocities of October 7th, followed by the indiscriminate bombing and the tens of thousands of innocent lives that people killed by Israeli airstrikes. That is so hard because people are so fervent. On both sides, and
it's a tragic loss on both sides. I mean, it's ugly everywhere.
And policing speech in that context seems to me like a nightmare, unless it's very obviously hateful. Like we
can't let it impact our country. You certainly don't expect me to believe that we're not seeing disruption across the country on this issue. I think.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And that's not the peaceable, tolerant, everybody embrace everybody multiculturalism that Canada was intended to be. And I think people are afraid on all sides.
So
my constituents are concerned.
No question. But if there's vandalism, if there's damage to person or to property, if there is harassment, if there is vile hate speech where people are truly vilifying Jewish people, and I've seen some speeches that have, or vilifying Muslims, and I've seen some speeches that have. I mean, I do think that laws need to be enforced in that way. I don't want someone who is in good faith attending a rally to be
Nobody
caught
wants
up in
that.
any of that.
Everybody wants peaceful protest. That's one of the things, that you've seen them all the time up on Parliament Hill. They come, they go, they have their day, and
Yeah.
that's part of our democracy, and everybody wants that.
But didn't
And
so you said okay? You've been clear, so these are your words from the House of Commons.
okay.
Whether you like it or not, I don't know. But I want to clearly state that I'm opposed to people who hate people on the basis of race, religion, color, or any of these things. I would have checked the box. I
mark.
completely agree. Completely agree. But then on the question of Islamophobia, and I know conservatives were tripping over themselves for a bit, you did say, I'm not sure what people mean by that. And you said, if I think of myself, I'm afraid that if ISIS jihadists came over, they might cut off my head and rape me. Is that Islamophobia? I don't know. Now, obviously, you've already used the word Islamophobia, so I think you've come to terms with it being proper hate speech. But at that point, at least, in Parliament, you were saying, I don't know this term, and I don't want it to be... Effectively, I think what you were saying is, I don't want it to be weaponized to capture people that aren't truly being Islamophobic and hateful. And I think the same we see sometimes now, where, whether people are accused of Islamophobia or they're accused of anti-Semitism, you want to capture true Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, but you don't want it to be so all-encompassing that you actually chill speech, which I think is where you were sort of starting about. People are afraid to say things and upset people, and that's a problem on its own.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly where you need to land. People need to be able to criticize what's going on in the world, in the country, but it can't be resulting in harassment, intimidation, violence, vandalism. All of these things are clearly illegal.
Yeah, that's right. We don't have to dwell on this.
We solved the world's problems, Nate.
And on religious freedom, there is. I mean, you've sort of walked an interesting line in some ways, because there you are in the leadership. You're walking in pride in Toronto. I'm sure that bothered some people on the more vehemently religious side of things of the Conservative Party. On the other hand, you then have said, while you vehemently oppose conversion therapy and you support the LGBTQ plus community, I support freedom of religion and speech, and you're trying to navigate this. I support the LGBT community, but I also support, a deeply religious community in some ways, and 90 churches or something that you had sign on. That's a tough thing to navigate, because again, very strong-held convictions, and you want to come out in a way that you, yes, protect freedom of expression, but you also protect people's dignity and their ability to be who they are.
Well, and as a leader, it's your job to represent all people, to make sure that all people's rights are protected. And you're right, not everybody likes that, but that is the job when you're the leader. And so that's where respect for all those groups comes from.
But don't you think, this will be my only question on this, I don't want to dwell on it, but when you say there are many people in this country who do not believe that a transgendered lifestyle is God's plan or that it's medically beneficial, and that's the end of sentence, don't you think the follow-on sentence correctly is, but transgender people still deserve to be protected at law, to be who they are and to live lives as who they are? People can believe a certain thing, but their belief shouldn't impact. It's like, it's tracking back to...
But they can believe it, I think my point.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think it's
But yeah, everybody has the right to be safe and to choose how they want to live. And so we need to protect that as Canadians, and that's part of the civil liberties portfolio, is to protect those charter rights and freedoms.
And do you worry at all when you hear, because you've lived under a few conservative leaders, you try to be the leader yourself, but it's interesting because Ronna Ambrose and Andrew Scheer, very different people. Aaron O'Toole and Pierre Poilievre, very different people, in contrasting views on some of these issues even. And so Poilievre is sort of rallying the troops in some ways to suggest that, Trudeau's cultural Marxist weird ideology, and he sort of tracks it back to trans stuff sometimes. Do you ever worry that is ultimately going to undermine people's feelings of safety and security who are trans?
I don't think so. I think that Pierre has shown that he's supportive of all the communities.
Including the trans community?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I mean, standing up for parents' rights doesn't mean you're not standing up for trans rights. I think that you could do both.
You can, in principle. In practice, so if I see Maxime Bernier, for example, I attended a counter-protest at Queen's Park at one point on my way to an Ontario Liberal leadership debate, and I can tell you it was very strange because there were so many purple signs. It was the People's Party kind of protest in a way.
I cannot in any way defend Max Bernier.
Well, exactly, but that's what But I don't think Bernier in any way has, when he weaponizes parental rights. And I don't mean to be dismissive of. I've got kids. I believe strongly in being a part of my kids' lives in a serious way, and parents get to choose where our kids go to school. That's there's lots of we determine the outcome of our kids' lives in many ways when they're so young, but. At the same time, you can weaponize it in such a way that what you're really whistling to is that you're opposed to trans people. And I think that's what Bernier in many ways has done. And that was. You're not worried about that when it comes to
weaponization of speech, for sure. I'm not worried about that with our leader. He's been respectful of all communities and will be fair. And I think that's part of the reason he put me in civil liberties, is he wants to stand up for everybody's rights and freedoms.
Okay, on civil liberties. This is my last question on civil liberties.
Okay, because it's QP, baby.
Oh yeah. Okay. No, okay. I've got one easy question after that, but then we're all done. Yeah, it's QP, baby. I love how you say it. It's very fun. I do not get that excited about QP. Okay, so drug policy. So I think you maybe softened, mellowed maybe is the right word when we're talking about weed. But when it comes to drugs, if we take a human rights lens, if we take a liberty lens, surely the criminal code is not the right way to be tackling substance use and addictions. That shouldn't we be treating this as a health issue and get the criminal code out of there and treat it as the health issue it is, number one, but more importantly, like respect freedom and move imprisonment completely out of the picture.
My recommendation was really that we needed to move to a fulsome prevention to recovery. We don't have enough recovery beds. I think all Canadians want to see addicts get off drugs and get their life back. So I think that needs to be the focus, how to help these people. But I don't think you're helping them to keep them successfully addicted to drugs. I think that's not where Canadians want their taxpayer dollars going. They want to see people helped out of the situation.
Are you helping them by putting them in jail?
I don't think that's what's happening right now. I think that you've seen in BC the disastrous decriminalization effort that they've got going on. In my riding of Sarnia Lambton, we have a huge drug issue. It's 4 times the provincial average. And what you see is a revolving door where people get arrested and they're let out the same day. So they're not really being put in jail. And so it's problematic because there's no supports for them.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of common ground in terms of
detox, 10 recovery beds.
I think there's a lot of common ground on supports.
Yeah.
Probably, if I think of a civil liberties perspective, we want to eliminate the criminal code for individual people who use drugs. But I take the point that, and I agree that an overwhelming emphasis has to be on addictions and treatment and recovery. Well, okay, my last question, which is an easy one. I start easy, I end easy. In your book, I'm told that you cast aspersions on hummus. Why don't you like hummus?
The heart just doesn't want what the heart doesn't want. I've consumed a lot of hummus, and my experience is that in order to make it taste good, you have to put a lot of stuff like garlic and red pepper and things that are not hummus in it to make it not taste like hummus so people will like it. If I had nothing else to eat, I'd probably eat it and be glad. But if I can choose, I choose to give it to others.
So we have agreed on some things. I think we deeply disagree on other things, and including on hummus.
But we were respectful, and that is our democracy.
Well, thanks, Marilyn. And as I was saying at the hop, I'm visiting your riding this weekend for unfortunate circumstances. But I hope to see you either in Beaches East York or in Ottawa or in Lambton County. Exactly. All right. Thanks, Marilyn.